Cracking the code. How 45Z tax credits are powering renewable fuels and energy independence. The USDA's new interim rule is a game changer for farmers and biofuel producers. Climate-smart agriculture and carbon tracking are shaping the future of biofuels. From emissions to efficiency, 45Z is changing the way we grow and fuel America. Stay ahead of the curve. Learn more today.
Everybody, welcome back to the Data Enriched Bushel podcast. I'm your host, Christopher Ruel, here with the JAG Group team and special guest, Dan Mehochko, to help you navigate the jungle of renewable energy, sustainability, and in today's episode, 45Z. Today, we're driving straight into the updates on 45Z. Got questions? Hopefully, we got some answers and maybe a few painfully good old farmer from North Dakota jokes, Dan? Maybe? All right. So on January 15th, the USDA published the interim rule on technical guidelines for climate-smart agriculture crops used as biofuel feedstocks. Agricultural Secretary Tom Vilsack said, and I have the quote here, "The new guidelines are a win for farmers, biofuel producers, the public, and the environment. The action today marks an important milestone in the development of market-based conservation opportunities for agriculture." Now, this rule complements the Clean Fuels Production Tax Credit, Section 45Z, by providing a standardized framework for assessing and verifying greenhouse gas emission benefits of climate-smart agricultural practices in biofuels feedstock production. So let's get into it. First,
can I ask a question first?
Yeah, sure.
What makes Dan Mehochko special? Special guest? Is that like his striking good looks?
Well, of
or
all the
videos
guests
from Illinois, what is it?
Well, of all the guests we've had, he's by far the most recent.
Yeah, and I don't think that's a list you have time for on this podcast. That's generally that's more like a Joe Rogan podcast where it goes on for hours. And
Oh gosh.
And I think I just answered your question.
I think you did. Are you thinking about doing a Dan Mehochko podcast?
I have some time, so I might be. Yeah, you never know.
There you go. There you go. So, Chris, I've already derailed your conversation, and so anyhow, but Dan, welcome. I just want to say thank you from beautiful 5 degrees below zero, Fargo, North Dakota today. Spring is not here, and it's not coming anytime soon the way it looks.
Actually, what? It's how rude of me, Dan Mehochko, Dan M. I forgot to ask you to introduce yourself. What's your background? Give us a quick biography.
Okay, all right, real quick. Spent 30 plus years in the grain industry, mostly as a trader. Came up through company like Continental Grain and then Louis Dreyfus, and then spent a number of years in the Growmark system as a business relationship manager. Started a company for Growmark, also managed one of the commodities groups, and then have been in a couple tech startup companies at the end of my career, and most recently just doing some consulting and looking for any opportunity to stay busy and stay out of trouble.
How's that trouble thing working out for you?
Not good so far.
Not good.
No.
Yeah, I get it.
Apparently when I have time on my hand, that's not my mom always told me that I needed to keep busy or I'd be in trouble, and apparently she was right. So
yeah, I had an old commander tell me, he's like, you'll be fine as long as someone's shooting at you for the rest of your life.
There you go. There you go.
I got some drywall work for you, Dan, in the basement. So just come on up to Colorado.
I love where you're at, so I could be out there.
Well, Dan, it's good to have you here. And
thank you.
Chris, I think you asked Brad a question.
Yes.
So why don't we bring it back to Brad, and we'll let Dan pontificate after a little bit down the road here. So
Brad, can you explain how the GREET model assesses the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of various fuels, and generally what role does climate smart agricultural practices play in these calculations?
Yeah, no, so the GREET model is a model we've been using for decades. It was developed in the early 90s by a gentleman named Michael Wang at Argonne National Labs. It's developed by the Department of Energy. It's a tool that allows us to calculate the carbon emissions associated with fuel production and the entire life of fuel production, everything from getting it out of the ground to combustion within the vehicle, the plane, the truck, the boat, you name it, on the other end of this. So that's what we say when it's a full life cycle assessment. It's assessing all of the emissions associated from the use of that fuel. in its combustion. So that's the function of the GREET model. Within it, what is it? It is, like the world's biggest Excel spreadsheet that is very difficult to work with. But that's what it is. It's a series of spreadsheets that have a bunch of lookup tables, and you would put all sorts of data in there. A lot about your refinery. How does your refinery operate? What sort of process is it running? What sort of power is it on? Does it burn renewable natural gas, regular natural gas, solar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So a lot of questions there. What's new and what's changing in GREET? GREET is a model that traditionally had a series of feedstock calculators in it. So we say feedstock in the context of biofuel. Traditionally, we mean corn, oils, bean oils, canola oils, these sorts of things. Used cooking oil, tallow, all of these are feedstocks into biofuels that we then use to produce ethanol, renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, and smaller amounts of biodiesel, right? And so the goal of the GREET model is statutory in some cases. It's helping calculate emissions. In this case, we have used the GREET model with the update from the Inflation Reduction Act to begin calculating the carbon intensity of fuels. Carbon intensity of fuel says it took this much carbon per megajoule. A megajoule is a measure of energy, like BTUs. That's how megajoules work. So how much carbon did it take for us to get that energy in place? And in the case of the Inflation Reduction Act, what it did was it hooked those reductions in carbon to a reward that we call the 45Z production tax credit, the PTC. That tax credit will traditionally, in the way that we've done it before, would acknowledge things that happen at the facility: combined heat and power, solar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, rail, barge transport, these sorts of things. What's new now is that we're going to bring the feedstocks in. And traditionally, we did not bring the feedstocks in. All corn was corn. All beans were beans. They had a national number. It doesn't matter where you grew them, how you grew them. They just had a number, and that's what went into the fuel. With the 45Z and this climate smart agriculture piece, it's using a chunk of a sub-model of the GREET model. So now we're going to go down into a chunk of it called the FDCIC, the Feedstock Carbon Intensity Calculator. This is a tool that's been around for years, but never been active. We've now made it active. And inside of that, we've put our climate smart agriculture practices. And when we use the feedstock carbon intensity calculator, what it allows us to do is to take credit for how it was grown, where it was grown, which practices, what might have been used, those sorts of things. So now all corn is not all corn. We can differentiate it. It can have a lower score. And with lower scoring corn, that allows my facility to earn, potentially earn more tax credits out of the other side. So I'll pause there, but that's the big takeaway is we have allowed corn and beans and all of these feedstocks to start getting scoring and start be differentiated on the way they were grown. And that is realized through the 45Z tax credit.
So with the interim rules that came out, I know you've shown me stuff and we went through them in detail. Are there any in there that excite you, and maybe some that weren't in there, or some that were in there that disappointed you?
I mean, one, the timing on all this is pretty crap. Like nobody's really thrilled that we waited this many years to spit out some rules at the last minute. So just general dissatisfaction with the way the last administration handled it. And now we're going to another administration, probably not a huge priority. So there's a lot of uncertainty and the lack of clarity. What we got were provisional sort of rules, but things we don't like. We don't like that they got rid of safe harbor. We liked safe harbor back in the 40B. This one doesn't appear to have safe harbor, which would mean that if we produce credits that were subject to fraud, we might have to be accountable for them. So that probably will drive up insurance on the transactions here for the brokerage. I don't like that. We are, again, that's the one major thing that I find we kind of pushed back against, besides the lack of clarity, right? We could always use more clarity on some of these rules. The pros here are it looks like what we expected. And this group has been kind of preaching this for coming up on a year now. It's not going to be the entire model where you get to turn all these knobs. It's a couple select practices with clearly defined practice standards that we're going to take forward. No-till, cover crop, et cetera. We'll go into more detail on that.
Hey,
right. So, yeah.
Hey, Brad, I'm going to interrupt just for a second, okay?
Yeah.
You just mentioned the new administration, but I'm going to throw another thing in here. Blender's tax credit. That's going away, though, right? And
BTC's gone.
It's gone. So now the refiners, they've got, the administration kind of likes oil, and I think they kind of like the farmers in the middle part of the country. How do is this still become a political vehicle, or is it not so much, in your opinion?
I think there's always politics around things like climate smart, right?
Okay.
So language is going to matter here around how we kind of frame this.
Yeah.
I think it's better to frame this as soil health if you want to do it that way. Inside this administration, one thing I have to remember about the 45Z is this has in some ways aligned oil and gas with ethanol, right? There's a little bit of a bet made here, and that is that, more electric vehicles, more efficient vehicles, less unleaded fuel, less ethanol consumption. But things like aviation fuel and renewable diesel, which are made by the refiners generally, that has a longer term horizon through 2040. So they're sort of saying, listen, we'll kind of ignore ethanol. We're going to focus on these fuels that are hard to replace. You're not going to put batteries on these planes. And so oil and gas, when they get that, just one way to remember how these credits are earned, right? They are earned at the refinery. So the ethanol refiner earns it right there at that refinery for each gallon of ethanol produced. The crush facility does not earn credits. The crush facility must ship that oil to California or to Diamond Green. And from there, they earn the credits, which will have to go back downstream. But regardless, oil and gas stands to earn credits here too. So in general, I hope we row in the same direction. They certainly have a lot of 45Q projects that they probably want to see as well from that Inflation Reduction Act. Some of that come true. So we're optimistic that comes with. I think the great tragedy here is we kind of don't do the little bit of work to bring the production tax credit online, and we roll back to the blender's tax credit. There's no money in that for farmers. There's no opportunity for corn or soybeans to matter anymore. It just rolls them off. So this 45Z, we kind of talk about it as, nice. It's important. This is the first time that we're saying to farmers, how you grow it matters. And if you grow it with less carbon, you can get rewarded for that.
So, Brad, when they announced this, I went online and I looked at the feedstock calculator, and the USDA touts it as a user-friendly tool, which is, that's verbatim. So can you bring us up and kind of show us and walk us through what it actually looks like for those of us that haven't seen it?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll say a few things. The tool is not user-friendly. The GREET model, the kind of model that lives above this, is a pure misery, and it only runs on Windows machines, and there's a whole FAQ on how to just get that right. The FDCIC is a little simpler. I'll bring that up here, and we can take a peek at it.
I got ADHD of public education and too many TBIs to count. So when you go through this, just what inputs are required, and more importantly, who's actually putting this in? Like who is the end user that's going to be entering this data in?
So in part of those regulations we were kind of touching on, the farmer will have to submit two things as part of their, I believe they call it a biofuels report. So when you go and make your first point of delivery, whether it's the ethanol factory, whether it's an elevator, you will have to deliver two pieces of documentation. One is an attestation. Everything I've said is true, and I'm going to keep my records for this. Two, you will need to send them an image of this, your calculations on the FDCIC. In general, you're going to select your crop type up here, corn, sorghum, and soybeans. You will need to put in the number of fields in the entity. This will be the legal entity that you've organized this business under. This is the number of fields. So one important caveat here is if you have an entity and it holds, say you put two farms together, one was a no-till farm and one was conventional, that you don't want to do, because now you're going to blend those scores, and I'll show you what that means. If I have 4 fields, it's going to generate 4 fields for me to put in. And that score down here at the bottom, which is the score that they're going to give your grain coming in, is the blend of these fields. And so we have 2 or 3 fields that are really, really good. And then we have a field or 2 that's just not got any practices on it. It might be worth your while to think about how you structure your entities so that you can get the most reward for that value on the other side. So let me show you without, because the other thing, as you add your fields to this spreadsheet will slow down. So you'll pick your state.
Kind of like me in the wintertime, right?
It's government made here.
So
Illinois.
I'll tell you, Brad, and Dan and Chris, that I know farmers that are sitting with accountants and attorneys right now talking about that very thing. That if do they have to restructure entities to maximize revenue on those kinds of fields that are out there? It also puts another aspect in the productivity ratios and numbers of what a farm is worth for rents and also for purchase. So landlords who have good practices, their land is more valuable. So if you don't have some of these things, I shouldn't say they're good practice. I mean, they're all good practices of what's in here, stuff we do today on our farms, and so it's interesting. So, but there's a lot of conversations going on right now about entity and entity structure based upon this, and does it make financial sense to tear apart those existing entities to create new ones?
Yep, and that just feeds into this uncertainty piece of it too. That is kind of the recurring theme right now. It's frustrating. Just real quickly, so then that kick what we call a FIPS code. FIPS code is just a number they give every county in the country, a unique number. Then you're going to select your practices on field 1, right? And you can put a name in here and that sort of stuff. You'll pick your different practices along here, and I'll do that in just a second. That gets expressed in the results down here. Okay, and so these values are pre-populated based on your county. And then what it does is, this is the number to watch right down here, the carbon intensity, the grams of carbon dioxide equivalents. We call them equivalents because there's nitrous oxide and other gases. 6,295 grams, or 6.295 kilograms. 6.2 kilograms is about what that is, 6.3. All right, so that number is consistent for corn. It's going to be corn. If I went back and changed this to soybeans, that number changes. Okay. So on corn, let's just go ahead and take a chance, and we'll go say, okay, I'm in Knox County, Illinois. I'm going to plant a cover crop. I'm going to have cover crop on this field. This number drops to 3986, a 36.7% reduction in those values. So the way to read that is, you have now changed that amount of cover crop by just over probably 3 kilograms per bushel of reduced emissions. So these are the numbers coming out. I just want to show one other thing. If I did 2 fields here, right, and this one has nothing going on, my combined score is 5140. Right, so 1 field, 3986. 2 fields brings it back up. So consistency and adding practice, Dan, again, to your point, organizing that entity in a way where you're kind of concentrating your best efforts, this model will reflect the average of those many fields. And that's the system. And so you will, as part of that, you will have to do these calculations. The farmer must do these calculations and submit that. I mean, they could do it with an entity or an agent, right? If they want to do it with their CPA, or they want to do it with us or anybody else, we can help them go through that. That they will attest is true in the attestation. This is all true. And I don't know if we want to talk about the verification and traceability, but that's another piece of this around record keeping and what'll have to be done there.
Yeah, I think the thing that we inject in here maybe is a little bit and some of the things that I know we've been working with is to find to be able to work either with a commercial grain company who supplies plants either for feed, fuel, or fuel. I think those are the kinds of things that we've been working on, so that you can move that grain along with a data set and those boxes that get checked and the information that needs to verify that, I think, is and attest to and document the attestation is going to be critical. And I know, we've been working pretty diligently on that with a number of companies. And one of the former people on this podcast, Jeff Schreiner from Cultura, was instrumental in kind of working on a lot of that. So anyhow, we can go back and take a look, and he can talk. If you look up the old podcast, you can take a look and see what he had to say in there. But I think that's going to be an interesting component. So, and how do you move it from my farm field into Dan's grain elevator into Chris's ethanol plant, I think, or into your food processing facility, Brad. So, I think those are the questions I think that that we have answers for. We know we do. So, but anyhow, I'm sorry. I get
absolutely. Yeah.
I
mean, those guys, sorry, just real quick on that first point of delivery, right? They're going to have the audit responsibility.
Yes.
Right. So where you deliver, they might come knocking and say, hey, square root of the deliveries that we took, we're doing the audit and you need to show us your records. The record keeping requirements are clearly defined in there as well.
Yeah.
It's not specific and like, hey, you must have a receipt of this type. It describes the type of proof. The audit would be performed by a third party.
So I got a kind of question that affects all of you here. Okay, so obviously not all practices are created equal, right? And certain combinations work better. I know, Brad, you've done some work in analyzing, what the potential payoff is for some of these. And I'd like to, and that's obviously going to be going through the plant, right? Because they're the entity that everything runs through. So looking at that, I was wondering if you could show us some of these practices and what the value is. And then, Dan, as a farmer, which ones are the low-hanging fruit for you? Which ones are harder to achieve? And then ultimately, what does that mean for someone like origination going back to Mehochko? And where is the revenue generated throughout this chain?
Yeah. Take you through some of these numbers before we get into them. They're big numbers. These are big numbers. And the reason is that FDCIC, it's kicking out big carbon values. So we're going to look at some of these numbers, and they're talking about knocking 4 kilograms per bushel off of corn. When you do 200 bushel corn, that's 800 kilograms an acre. And when we worked in the offset world, you need 1,000 of those kilograms to get an offset, a 1 ton offset. And in this program, the implied value of 1 ton of carbon is in that $250 range. So when we look at these values, we're talking about being able to do almost 0.8 of a ton in reduction per acre on a credit value of $250-ish. So when we see these numbers, don't be surprised to see some big numbers associated with payments.
So Brad, didn't a lot of the models for the private markets have that ton sequestered over several years, right? And it looks like this is coming out of one season. Or
there are there are many questions around the attribution. We could get into the nerd talk of this. I don't want to take it down, but yes, You're exactly right. Because some of what this looks like to us is that we are sort of calculating 1 year's soil carbon and next year's soil carbon independently, when in reality, they're unions and we need to do an attribution. So we're not double counting, but we're sort of extra counting in some ways. So there's a little bit of that concern. We have done some work internally to reveal the hidden tables inside of the FDCIC so we can start to explore the soil carbon values inside of it and really get into the nuts and bolts and find the counties where you have the biggest intervention potential. Reach out, connect with us. We'd love to tell you more about that. But that's a place where, one caveat here, I'll give 2 caveats before we look at values. One, these numbers might change, they might come back and turn them down, et cetera, right? Like this is proposed rules. So please don't make decisions, investments, or anything based off of this. This is just some calculations we put together for people to take a look at. The rules are not final. 2. Do
you know when they're going to be final, Brad?
April 10th is the end of the RF of the request for information that came out from Treasury. So our hope is maybe it's more finalization around this. We'll find out.
Brad, I also want to thank you just really quick about warning us about those numbers, and they might be big. I go through that every morning before I get on the scale. Just so you know, I kind of go, that's a big number.
Well, these are big payouts. These are big
Ah,
payouts.
there you go.
Yeah. This is the other caveat here is that it assumes you're in a qualifying facility. The facility must have reduced, and this is in code, we can go into this. It has to be, I'm assuming you've already gotten to halfway or better. And all of this is adding more 45Z. There's a lot of, if your facility's at a 50 something kilogram CO2e per million BTUs, that's going to be a different story here. So again, a couple of assumptions made here, but let's hop into those numbers. Okay. So let's start in Coddington. So we've picked a couple. We've got three counties in corn and 3 counties in soy. So we'll go through each one, and we'll go through corn first. And just to show you some variability within corn, and then variability between the 2 cropping systems. Sorghum is an odd combination of soybeans and corn because it has similar practices available to it as corn, but lower yields like beans. So think of it as producing sort of an intermediary between the 2. Off the top, right now, we're going to operate on 184.6 bushels in Cottington County, South Dakota. So we look at that value per acre. That's what that's based off of right there. This is the carbon intensity reduction, that CI points you hear about. And we're seeing some big points here. 19.1 here for cover crop, no-till, and nitrification inhibitor. $1.16 a bushel, $215 on that field. Again, these are big numbers.
So these are not what I would get on my farm, but it would be what the blender would get as a gross
refiner.
Refiners, okay, yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So this would
and then
be your.
They have to. So it's kind of like going to the grocery store, getting a dozen eggs at $10. I'm going to use that number right now, and I, as the farmer who has the hens that lay the eggs, I may be getting $2.
Correct.
Okay.
We don't know what the shake is yet.
Don't know what the, yeah. Okay. Got it.
And everybody's got to take a bite, right? Because the tax credit has to be brokered and insured in that transaction. So that's going to take 10-ish percentage points out of it. You got to pay for all this data and information and sort of just the program. So, there are costs to running and operating this. The verifier is going to be a real cost in this as well. So you're right, Dan, the amount that gets exchanged, and to kind of the facility point, if your facility is not qualifying and they can use feedstock to take them into qualifying, that could be valuable to them. So it might be more valuable to that group to spend money on feedstock because they don't have the money to put in combined heat and power or do the engineering things to the facility to get qualifying. The other thing to look at here is there are certain practice combinations that aren't allowed by the model. So in the model, if you try to select cover crop and spring only fertilizer, it won't let you do that. That's not an available practice combination within the model. So you'll see that in corn, sorghum, and the beans. They have unavailable practice combinations. I'm going to scoot down.
Can you explain to me why, for everybody, why they did that? Do you have an idea why they did that? So an example, cover crop, no-till, split season, nitrogen stabilizer.
Yeah, why I don't know, Dan. I don't know why they've now there's some agronomic reasons, but is there a modeling reason where they did the math and it turns out kind of doesn't work or whatever? I don't know. I don't know. We're just working from that FDCIC. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
I think here the thing to look at is here's the impact of yield. You can get more yield. The reason corn gets huge numbers is because corn puts down a lot of carbohydrate per acre. It's just the way it is. And that carbohydrate makes a lot of fuel. So 1 bushel of corn is making almost 3 gallons of ethanol, whereas 1 bushel of beans is making like 1.5 gallons of diesel or aviation fuel, right? And just because of that, you're generating more. The tax credit comes to the gallon, not to the bushel. And so if you have a bushel that makes more gallons, you will receive more tax credit, right? That's just the way the math shakes out on this stuff. So again, big numbers. Will the farmer see all of $286.35?
No.
Probably not. No. Canton, Iowa, looking here again, you'll notice these CI reduction values change. That's based on the county. So even though all corn starts with the same value, the amount we subtract for practices varies by the county. So some counties are going to do better than others when it comes to certain practice types. I will go and take a peek at soy here. So soy is always going to have lower numbers because of what we just talked about around the production of fuel. But what's wild about soy is it has some of the lowest carbon values in the FDCIC. There are times where it will calculate negative values. So that means we're negative. So we're doing cover crop, no-till, nitrification inhibitor. That is a negative, over a negative a kilogram per bushel of beans coming off of there, which is a wild number, again, calculated out of there. But because the yield of fuel, the yield of beans and the subsequent yield of fuel is lower than corn, these values are going to be lower. Here's going out to Knox, Illinois again, seeing some of the higher values that are out there. And then the last one we had in here, guys, was Buchanan, Iowa, again, coming back to some of these values in the 30s, 60, 67. So all big numbers. The other piece I would take away from this, Dan's, is this is producing some parity in the market that's saying, here's what no-till is worth. So if you were in a program before and they were paying you for no-till, all of a sudden it's like, well, woof. If I can go out there and get $80 or $100 on that acre instead of 20, 30, 40, it could put some real pressure on those guys. We might see these numbers trimmed in the future, but that's an exciting place to start from for value.
So it looks like no-till is probably the clear winner for a practice change for bang for your buck. So Dan, up where you are in North Dakota, I know cover crops aren't really an option, right?
No.
So what does that look like for a North Dakota farmer versus an Iowa farmer?
Yeah. So, I think it's kind of similar, but I think one of the things we got to look at, and this is where it becomes interesting, and Dan, I'm going to be interested to hear what you have to say about this, and that's, this basically puts that floor in as to what a practice is worth. So again, back to feed or fuel and fiber, and food, that merchandiser is going to have a unique situation. No different than I probably would. Now, I'm not going to put cover crops in here because I can't, because I got 10 days to harvest. That's about it. There's nothing that's going to grow after I get done because it's too darn cold. But if I take a look in there at my costs, so then I take a look at split season application. Split season application may mean that I go over my field 3 times, with a little bit in the fall, a little bit in the spring with both the planter, mid season, and then towards the end to get the maximum amount of yield on my corn, but yet use the amount of nitrogen, the least amount of nitrogen I can possibly use to continue to push it to the end. If I look at the guys who get big numbers as far as corn yields, on these contests and stuff, they are all pushing hard on late season nitrogen and late season moisture. They want that that corn kernel to fill, and you start taking a look at some of those guys' kernel weights are huge. Now, I bring that up only because split season may mean that I have an extra application. So what's my cost going to be at the farm level for that? Is it $8, $10, $12? Don't know. I may save some money on fertilizer because I might not need as much if I don't get a bunch of heavy rains. So I think you take a look at that. I'd put a stabilizer down with it because that's what we do. And it's like, so, I as a grower, I'm going to have to take a look at my practices and what my cost is and what I potentially could get out of that gross number that Brad had on the far right side of his graphs. That's what those are. Now, I also think, do I, as a grower, then how do I market those bushels with the data enrichment? Because if all I got to do is check the box and show that I use a nitrogen stabilizer and then take my tractor information and sprayer information and spreader information and put it in to document that, what's it going to be? So then I go back to the grain elevator, the commercial, or to the ethanol plant. The ethanol plant's going to give me what they're going to give me because of this is what it's worth to them. That's pretty simple. But now I mean, we've grown beans and corn for feeding operations, and we make more money on it because it's high lysine soybeans or whatever it might be. So now I go back into it and think, all right, so what's the merchant going to do, and what's that grain elevator going to do, the commercial? Dan, what does this kind of information do for you from an origination perspective, and then also the merchandising perspective?
Yeah, a couple things. First, Chris, you said practice change. It doesn't necessarily have to be a practice change. This is your
No,
practice.
These
These are
your
my
change.
practices.
This
Yeah,
is my,
yeah,
this is my
we don't have to do
practices.
anything different.
You could make the change to get to some of this, but this is your practice.
Yeah.
It's not like what
Yeah.
we used to hear
Yeah.
in the past. Second of
Right.
all, Brad, when you said the farmer has to put this data in, that's where I think country elevators and first buyers of grain can play a big role here. They'll help do that to provide some of that service, and they can take their clip and provide the farmer the best market for that bushel, right? It is X value. We don't always see if people that don't do it every day, they're not always good at finding a different market for the best to get the most out of that. That's what you want to get as a grower. You want to get the highest percent you can. That might just be going to your local country elevator first buyer and let them help you accumulate that data and then market it out there. And then if I'm an ethanol plant, and I might want to look at originating more grain and take what I can off the best bushels, right? I might go find grain that has a lower score and be buying that to get some more of that to pass some more of that tax credit on. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in merchandising and arbitraging this grain. I mean, it's like trading another grade factor, right? I mean, it opens up a whole new world, a different world than we're used to, but it's just trading a grade factor. This is going to be one more factor added to this grain.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking there's going to be a lot of data. Dan, you call them the name of this podcast, right? These are data enriched bushels. So it means there's going to be record keeping every step from field to trade to end user. And I know Mehochko is a consummate merchandiser by how he lowballed me on my watch the other day. So, yeah.
There's a buyer and a seller, and that's how we determine a market. You are the
Yeah.
seller. You didn't put a price. I'm a buyer. I set a price. I never saw a counter to that. I'm expecting a watch being sent to me and a request for that money. That's all I know.
So you see the elevators and the originators coming in to help with some of this data, as a revenue source, but also as a risk reduction, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's a way for them to. So right now, you see in a lot of areas, right? You see end user go direct to a grower by grain or someone else coming in that market. I mean, if I can provide a service and help, I mean, I'm going to tell you that most farmers are going to look at that and not want to do that data. They're not going to want to put that in, right? That's not where their big comfort level is. I'm guessing there's a lot of operations that are doing it, but I'm going to tell you the majority are not going to want to do that. So if they can find somebody to help them with that, provide that service, and that's a way to stay sticky to that grower and help them earn some of that. And it might be that country elevator keeps a part of it, but it might be that they keep that business, right? And there's other rewards to it down the road. But I think that's a big service to offers to help with that.
With those
Chris,
big numbers,
you talking about my scale again?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest numbers.
Oh.
So, with those large numbers, there seems to be a lot of money on the table now on these margins. So do you see this possibly into like bidding wars between different originators with the farmers for that?
I would be careful when I say there's a lot of money in these margins, because that's not true. There's a lot of potential tax credit availability. So for a tax credit to be worth anything, you have to be able to take a tax credit. Okay, so that means some of that is going to be sold, right? I'm going to sell tax credits because maybe my business can't use it. So that's a whole different world. So is there potential increase in per bushel price or premium available? It appears that way. They're going to be, as Brad mentioned, there's a lot of layers to it and how that's going to get distributed, because you have a lot of people have to come into that. You have to pay a third-party auditor for a percent of those acres that are participating. That's a cost. The verifier, and then the whoever's going to broker that tax credit. All those people, they have to be paid for their business. Okay, so, but it appears that there are some increases in premiums and dollars per acre available. So on the farm side, I'd want to work with whoever could help me get the most of it, right? And get that back to my farm. As a merchandiser, I want to do the same thing. I want to have availability of those bushels to arbitrage them in the best market. Whoever pays the highest premium for that data. You're not paying it for the actual bushel. It's all mass balance. You're paying it for the data. You're paying it for the availability, but I have to be a buyer of that grain.
So Dan, I got to ask you a really quick question. If you were, I know this train has left the station already. If you were a young merchandiser,
Yep.
Sorry, I've been giving you a bad time.
That's okay.
If you're a young merchandiser, what kind of grower would you be looking for right now?
I'd be looking for grower with the best practices. So
Okay.
First, so what I would do, I've said this in a couple of meetings with people, is I would be assigning a young merchandiser, originator, intern, whatever, to find me, to use that, or use we used to call fish finders, right? Those programs that can show you where those best bushels are, those practices are. And I would find the growers that are already involved in those practices, and that's where I'd be developing my relationships.
So if I may ask another question, I'm the general manager at a grain company or at a commercial location someplace. What do I need to be able to enable that young originator to go out and find those things? What do I have to think in my mind what's the opportunity going to be in my mind to say,
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to put this young man or woman on, and they're going to find these farmers who have these great practices. Why should I do that?
Yep. You have to think that they're essentially adding another grade factor to grain, right? And so when we trade grain, let's say you just trade 2 yellow corn, right? But there's some days, some facilities don't always have the highest quality. So maybe that you have X amount of grain that's higher FM, and your normal market, they don't want FM. So sometimes you have to trade that into a different market to get to what we would call a scale, right? I'm trading a scale in my FM. It's the same thing here, right? But it's going the other direction. So I know that I need to know that there's markets that will pay me for the data that's going to be attached to those bushels. And so, I'm going to start with my person who's going to develop a relationship with the grower and know where that data is, know where those bushels are, and who has the bushels with the highest scores that Brad just showed. And then for my merchandiser, maybe they're the same person, I have to have the ability to go out and find those markets and who's going to pay for that. If you think of, there's some areas, depending on where you are in the Midwest, you might be marketing into 4 different ethanol plants, but they might not all be able to pay this. They might not be able to have the same tax credit available, which means they can't pay a premium, right? Now, like Brad said, there might be somebody that's over 50 that would want to pay more to get under, to take advantage of that. So you just have to have the ability to know the data. And this is why I say I think grain elevators, country elevators will be helping enter that data, because I need to know that it's right. I need to make sure that Olson Farms maybe didn't fabricate that because they want that scale number to be a little less, so maybe they don't always put the right data in. So I got to make sure that data is correct when I'm out there merchandising it.
So you mean if I put my hand on the edge of the counter when I'm taking my weight in the morning and it's 3 or 4 pounds less?
It could. There's ways to manipulate a scale.
Count it.
So I got a question. Okay, so Dan, with your experience as a lifelong farmer, investor in ethanol plants, founded and built ag tech companies, you probably have the best holistic view of this industry. What do you see as the weak point in the industry now to tie this all together? Like what's the risk?
Fear of the unknown. Fear of the unknown is quite really where it's at. And I think it's where do we see as a visionary type, I'd like to think of myself that way. What are the opportunities that could be there? That's why I think it's really important. And Dan, that's why I ask the questions, is that sometimes in the grain business, people get kind of set in their ways, and people who want to trade a lot of times with their friends. Okay. This is a disruptor. This is a disruptor that has a value attached to it. And so then it becomes a situation is like, how do I do this? Do I, as a grain originator for a company, now you hired me, brought me in, I'm a young grain originator. I'd go out and first off, I'd use technology to find out where those fields are that have cover crops on them, if they have any. Secondly, I'd take a look at rotation. I'd take a look also at potentially what some of the soil types are that could hold more, the ability to hold more carbon or get a higher yield, especially in soybean situations. I would then also take a look and say two things. Number one, I'd go back and I'd take a look at, can I get closer to an agronomist that understands what's going on and why, and be able to tell the farmer as a team. And a lot of co-ops have both agronomy and they have grain sales, okay? And so they normally haven't talked too much together, as we've seen in the industry. I think this is the time when they're going to have to talk, because now you're going to be able to take those receipts, and Brad, I see you're doing this, take those receipts, tie them into the grain contract so that now you become seamless. And I, as a grower, don't want to continue to put myself in a situation where I got to provide all this paperwork. I want systems to do that. I want connectivity, and that's why we had Jeff on, a podcast ago to talk about, can their systems, their accounting systems, and their grain companies that they work with, can they do those kinds of things? And that's where I see this happening. Fear of the unknown. Do I want to go out and meet somebody new? What I want to, as a young originator, standing alongside my merchandiser, who's been trading stuff for a long time with these particular people, encourage him or her to go out and knock on the door of General Mills, go knock on the door of Danone, go knock on the door of Walmart. They might not know how to do that. But I think that's the partnership relationship that I think is going to have to happen in the future. Agronomy, origination, and then over to the merchandising side. And the merchandisers are going to have to understand 45Z and this credit, this whole thing that came out, put a floor in to say, okay, this is what it's worth. This is what that practice is worth in my county. That's what, Chris, to answer your question, it's the fear of unknown. I think, how do I get there? How do I make it work? There are people to lean on that can help you do that. And I think those are the kinds of things, Dan, you would know what I'm talking about. You could easily figure out how to lean on somebody in that situation and help those younger people move along and do those things. Brad, to be able to account for it. And I think those are the kinds of things that you do incredibly well with you and your team. And it's like, so, and me, I'm worried about the scale and, and cold weather, but, I think
to your
that's
point,
what
Dan,
Chris said.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm good.
No, your point on communication here. We look at nitrogen inhibitor.
Yeah.
If you're selling a bunch of nitrogen inhibitor, and in Knox County, Illinois, that's worth $28.50 an acre and 45Z return.
Yeah.
And it costs $10 an acre,
10,
to get it out there.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, the inhibitor's pretty cheap.
Yeah.
All right. And we were talking to another person that was out there doing strip till as a service to help you get your stir score down and qualify for that reduced till aspect of this as well. So some of this you're going to be able to kind of arbitrage on, right? Like, it's worth more over here. Just take it, use it, but you got to come bring the grain back to me.
Yeah, this is an evolutionary time in the industry, very much so. And it's, how do you accept knowledge? Look, it isn't just about what's coming out on 45Z. It's a matter of, how does, and I'm going to bring this up, and I probably shouldn't, but how does artificial intelligence go into this? How do you take a look at a stack of contracts in your queue and you have access into your system, and you can take a look at what's out there around you? You can just ask AI to go do that, as long as you can see what your contracts are, your delivery points, and all those kinds of things, and use AI to tell you, well, if I ship that over 30 miles down there to that ethanol plant, I can make an extra nickel today.
Advanced ontologies through semantic knowledge graphs. That's the AI solution.
I don't know what that means, man.
But hold on, I do want to say this here. What we are talking about is the big transition, right? What's happening over 20 years? More satellites in the sky, more sensors on tractors, more sensors in the field, right? More data on that field, and more people downstream are ascribing value to that data, and they want that data to move, period. Whether that's about carbon, it doesn't matter. Sustainability is what we're talking about right now, because we have this value proxy that we can use. But this is all we're seeing, is that transfer of data from the field to those people downstream
Right.
that want to use it in some way, shape, or form. And we're not launching less satellites. We're not putting fewer sensors on the tractor. We're not putting less in the field to detect stuff. And all of that will feed, Dan, to your point too, feed into that AI where, one of the things that I think you'll see by 2040 is the idea of farm wisdom. Man, that computer is a lot smarter than 50 years on that farm. It's going to be very quick and very good on some of that stuff and transform that data into that.
Yeah. The other thing I think that's really important to think about in here, in the world of the political uncertainty maybe that we have, or just maybe fear of unknown there too, a little bit, that I think we all kind of go through. A lot of changes, been a lot of saber rattling with tariffs and different things like that will go on, come off. And, so what we're talking about here isn't just something for the United States. The data and the information, if I take a look at the biggest ethanol groups in this industry, in conversations with their leadership, they're thinking about global ramifications. And other countries look at things differently than we do. And the biggest ethanol facilities that I know are always thinking about what's going on the globe, not just what's here, because they have the ability to load it up, ship it out, put it across the ocean to someone else. And I think those are the things that we've got to think about a lot, is that it isn't just about the political environment here. And what this has done is it's not only about fuel, it's about feed and fuel, and in some cases fiber. So, and I think from Dan's perspective in the grain origination and merchandising side, this creates a whole new opportunity. That's my opinion. So, and it's a global opportunity. It's just not here.
If you take a look at that FDCIC where we opened up the worksheets that weren't available, one of the comparisons that's being run is the comparison between the Canadian Clean Fuels Regulation tool called, we have the FDCIC here, they have the GHG Genius, and they're comparing this. So part of the other thing that 45Z does is it aligns our production kind of rewards with global production rewards. And Canada, the UK, the EU, December, 180 million gallons was exported. Over 100 million of that went into regulated markets for which data must come with that fuel for it to be able to be consumed in those places. So even when we don't necessarily stick to fuel targets in the US, New Zealand, Japan, the UK, these folks all have fuel targets. They meet them by purchasing American renewable fuels because we have the best costs and the most renewable, the most sustainable renewable fuels out there because we produce carbohydrates at a better price than anybody else out there. So the ability of us to dominate these export markets, targeting tariffs, Canada, no retaliatory tariffs on ethanol proposed because they have to meet their climate commitments. Colombia was not even going to retaliate because they need to hit 10% blend rate on ethanol. And guess where they get it from? Not Brazil.
Yeah, you saw on social media the other day, there was a big, people got all excited because they took global or climate change and everything off a few government websites. And, this is the end of this stuff. No, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we do here. I don't care what we do here. If Europe or Japan is my main market and they tell me what they have to get it, then that's what I have to do. It doesn't matter what we think. It's what your market thinks.
The market always sets the conditions.
Yeah.
All right. So gentlemen, we're coming up on our hour for this podcast. Just want to go around any closing thoughts from the group before we wrap this up.
I said the least, I'll go first. I think that, if you don't think this isn't going to keep growing, the need for this data and the need to know how that grain was produced and its score, and this is going to be essentially a new grade factor, I think we're mistaken. I think it's going to keep going. We produce this data, and to think somebody can't find a use for it, I think is mistaken. So I think the more the more this will keep continuing to grow, and the more information, the market will be asking for this, and I think it's going to be beneficial to both the grower, the grain merchandiser, be it on the country level or at a processor, to know that number and to have access to that data, which means it has a value.
Dan, I'll give you the last word. I would just really think about the second order effects here. We talk about the feed market. Okay, well, distillers' grains are coming out of here, meal's coming out of here. What does that mean about its carbon intensity and its scoring? What does that mean if I'm a food company buying no-till grain to meet some of my commitments out here? And now there's a price floor underneath of that. So there's a real cost to that sustainability other than just hand waving. What does this mean if I want to make claims around my reductions and I say, well, hey, my carbon footprint is this, and I'm using the numbers from the government, right? They're perfectly good for their tax program, good for me. So I think it's interesting to see how this sort of spreads out and creates a precedent for other programs as we look at this. So this is, again, just kind of the beginning of it.
Yeah, I think I think it's interesting, Brad, when you bring that up, because I'm thinking about corn going into a pig. Then everything that happens now, you and I normally think about stopping it at the bacon and the ham, but there's all of the leftovers are used in dog food and all these other things, and all of that adds up, and it's not. So now, with these numbers, you've got opportunities, I think, that are going to be unique. And how do you do that? Back to your point, Dan, the data is not going to stop. It's going to keep on. And it's going to only get probably more and more important from, food safety. Let's throw that in there just for a second. Who is the secretary that just got nominated? And I don't know if he's approved yet or not, but, is he about changing the way America eats? And food safety. So you got
pro-regenerative ag as well. That
Yeah.
was an AgriPulse thing this morning about that.
Yeah. So you can take a look at all of these different things. Maybe we're not so carbon sensitive, maybe we are, but the fuels world has its unique things. At the same time, we put someone in who's very about how do we bring new food, or good quality whole food into whole food is, I think, the words he uses, and I probably talk just a little bit like that, but it's like he's going to make a point, and he's got an audience and a following. And I think that this is going to be an interesting world for agriculture this time, incredibly important. Don't run away from data. If you've got questions and how to do it from a merchandising perspective to a quantification perspective and verification, and just, where do you find the capital and things to do all these things? Don't be afraid to reach out. We're friends. And that's, I think, the most important part, that we build great partnerships. And I think that if we can help you in some way or shape or form, please reach out, and we'll gladly talk about it. It's a challenging time, and you have to look at all aspects of it. So I really appreciate all the hard work everybody's done. And Dan, you look good, I got to tell you.
I try, man.
Hey, everybody. So thanks for joining us, the Data Enriched Bushel podcast. As Dan Olson mentioned, please feel free to reach out to us at jagaggroup.com, and we will connect you with the right people and the right expertise to solve all of your sustainability needs. All right, gentlemen, thanks for coming out, and I'll see you on the next podcast.
Thank you.
We'll see.